Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to the Nefer post-release analysis video. This video is coming out very late. I apologize for that. I didn't record a Nefer first impressions either. When Nefer came out was right around the same time as we got all the exciting leaks about the character buffs, so I was really interested in that, and I kind of didn't pay enough attention to Nefer because of it. Anyways, as you may have noticed, this is an account that has Nilou and her skin. This is not my account. I ended up not going for her, and I'll go into detail about all the reasons why, but it's not because she's weak. Anyways, as usual for the post-release videos, we go through the pre-release video, we talk about what we got right, what we got wrong, what we missed. As we're gonna see once we get into reading her actual kit, her base gameplay loop is entering a stance that allows her to do a certain amount of attacks, and doing those attacks until you don't have any anymore, and just repeating that. And rather than being gated by cooldowns, you're just gated by how quickly you can do those attacks. Okay, so that's not entirely true. It is to some extent that you are gated by how quickly you can do those attacks, but there's another thing that can prevent you from doing attacks as quickly as you would want, which is Verdant Dew. If Nefer's combos were leaked fairly early on, Verdant Dew wouldn't have been a problem, because Verdant Dew generation isn't that fast, but if you start with 3, since you generate 1 Verdant Dew every 2.5 seconds, if your charge attack takes a little bit longer than 1 second to execute, by the time you get to the 6th charge attack, which by the way, Nefer's skill is 2 charges and lets you do 3 charge attacks, so you want 6. By the time you get to the 6th charge attack, only 7.5 seconds need to have elapsed, because you only need to generate 3 as long as you're starting with 3, and then you can generate 3 again for the start of your next setup, or for the start of your next uptime during your setup. The thing is, I'll show you both the speed of the combos that we had been shown by leakers at the time, and the combos that you can actually do. This is what the leakers had shown us at the time. As you could see, I wasn't really struggling with Verdant Dew. By the time I got to my 6th charge attack, I almost already had the 6th Dew back. But here's what you can actually do. That wasn't perfect execution, pretty far from it, and we still had some issues. 1, 2, 3, 4. On the 5th one, we're already waiting for Dew. And then on the 6th one as well. And so you have like 1.5 to 2 seconds of just waiting. The thing is, Nefer has 2 charges of her skill. And while she can't maintain her enhanced charge attacks after swapping, there's nothing that stops you from swapping between the 2 skills. You can do 1 skill with 3 charge attacks, then swap, and then the other skill with 3 charge attacks. In a team like this one, that doesn't allow you to do too much. You get to go refresh your instructor on Cookie, maybe. Or use Cookie's Burst if it's available. You can also incorporate Nefer's Burst. But generally, those are fairly low impact things. And because of that, characters that are generally not that great because of long animations, or that I've talked about at least in the initial video as not that great because of their long animations, or short uptime, such as Nahida with her long animation on the burst, and Sucrose with her short uptime on the EM buff, will both be able to work fairly well. With Sucrose, And you can repeat something like this. Alright, here we have the Sucrose Burst itself refreshing her buffs, so we don't have to swap out, so we use Nefer's Burst instead of swapping back to Sucrose to refresh buffs. And that was it for, like, the characters that are gated by buff uptime. Now let's show characters that should be gated by rotation length. Whatever. Energy was a little cooked at the start there, but it is what it is. Alright, so instead of having the Nahida part of the setup before we swap to Nefer, we do the Nahida part of the setup in between the two charge attacks. And because Nahida's buff duration is long enough, right, the buff is still going from doing it in the middle of last rotation here. And so we don't have to swap back to the Nahida. Before our first charge attack. Little suspicious health-wise, but it's fine. With really tight execution, you have time to add in a swap to Aino to refresh Instructor as well. If you don't do things like this, I want you to try to pay attention to the timer after I get my first rotation out of the way so I can start with full energy and show you what it's actually like. So, if we don't, let's start at 35 and see how long a rotation takes. Right, and we end up starting our next rotation at 17 seconds on the timer, which was an 18-second rotation in this case. Which technically isn't a problem. Technically, Nefer's skill cooldown is 9 seconds, so in order to get 2 skills, you need to do 18-second rotations. But if you get staggered at a time where it actually delays any of your actions in a rotation like this, it actually will extend your rotation. Whereas, if you do the setups I was talking about earlier, there's actually time to spare, which means that even if something goes wrong, your rotations will still be 18 seconds. And because she has 2 charges, she can actually do like 16-second rotations for a solid like 3-4 rotations before you actually run into a problem where you're eased on cooldown when you want to use it. And if the enemies have any sort of stall phases, you can catch back up to your cooldown during those stall phases. Anyways, all of this to say, Verdant Dew generation actually also does affect how you want to build her teams, and it does quite significantly too. In my very first impressions on Nefer, I wasn't aware yet of how long her animations were. So I talked about it pretty much assuming that the animation time wasn't really a gate. And then we realized that animation time was a problem. And so I talked about how that made her a lot worse than I initially thought. Well, now that we have actual footage of animation cancels on Nefer, she's kind of back to the initial, where with good enough combos, your rotations won't really be longer than what your cooldowns allow. It'll still depend on the team, obviously, but at the very least, it's a possibility. Okay, so compared to my very first impressions on Nefer, just combo-wise, I think that holds up, but she also just got a straight nerf. Nefer, just like Lauma, also has 200 base EM. Yeah, so at the time she had 200 base EM, they just nerfed it to 100 for fun. Every 100 point of Nefer's EM beyond 500 will strengthen this regeneration effect by 10%, up to a maximum of 50%. Basically, this is a passive that allows her to generate Verdant Dew a bit faster when she's on field. By default, Verdant Dew is capped at 1 per 2. Okay, yeah, so at the time, I don't think I realized this. You don't enter the Slither state unless you try to do a charge attack when you don't have Verdant Dew. Like, you can actually look at it here. When I do a charge attack, I just do the charge attack itself. And entering the Slither state only happens when I'm out of Verdant Dew. What that means is that this doesn't actually increase the speed of her Verdant Dew generation. It just makes it so that when you're out of Verdant Dew, if you try to do a charge attack, but you don't have Verdant Dew, so it doesn't go through, it makes it so that your next Verdant Dew will be generated a little bit more quickly. The problem is, in order to proc this, you need to be out of Verdant Dew. But if you start with full Verdant Dew, you do 3 charge attacks with good cancels, you will have regenerated at least 1 Verdant Dew, so you can't do this. So you have to use E again, and then you E, and then you have 1 Verdant Dew, you use it, then you do the next attempt at a charge attack, and it doesn't work, so you get this effect, but you still have to wait for them. And so doing this isn't better than just swapping out. It's not better than just swapping out after your 3rd charge attack to do something else, to just wait out the Verdant Dew generation naturally, right? Because technically, it means you'll be able to get your 3rd one out a little bit faster, but you'll have added field time to Nefer that you could have just spent on someone else. This will basically just mean that it'll be 1.25 seconds of Verdant Dew generation instead. Actually, I'm not sure if it's 1.25. The way that this 50% work could be 50% less time or 50% more speed. But it doesn't really matter because the hydro units and the demo units that are used in Nefer teams don't really often lead you to problems with Verdant Dew generation. Yeah, about that, buddy. That's wrong. And the reality is that the motion value on this is just not great. As we're gonna see later, Nefer actually has some pretty solid output, and as we talked about earlier, she is gated by animation length, which means using a long burst animation for something that just does. Yeah, so again, right, this is another consequence of the combos being much faster than we thought at the time. There's a lot of teams where there's no reason not to use the burst. You don't care that much about the burst, like it's not something that's actually significant, right? If you look back to the earlier gameplay that I did, a burst is like about as much damage as 1 charge attack. So it's really not that big of a deal whether you get it or not, but it's one of the things that you can do to wait out your Dew generation. You can also do it at the end of your field time if you just have cooldowns you need to be waiting for anyways. It's basically just one more option in her rotations, but it's not particularly impactful. The way that you can think about it is the burst button is an optional thing you can press when you feel like it. You don't have to build energy to get it, so ER is pretty much a useless stat on her, but it's not bad to use when you have it available. I think I would still say that ER is basically a useless stat, despite the burst being a bit more useful than I thought at the time, because it's very rare that you only have one thing you could be doing during Nefer's burst, like the time that you could spend on Nefer's burst, and it's rarely going to be like that much better than your alternatives anyways. ER is like not that good. Let's talk about rotation length. Baiju's burst gives a Lunar Bloom damage based on his HP, and so a lot of people would think, oh, that should be pretty good for Nefer. Well, the reality is that because his burst animation is fairly long because he's a 5-star character, when you have Baiju on the team, using your burst straight up gimps you. Okay, so that's not the case anymore. Using a character like Baiju's burst, if you're doing it between your Nefer E's, it doesn't actually significantly extend your rotation length. But with Baiju specifically, his burst is still a 20-second cooldown, so you can't use it every rotation, so he's still not that good. If you have Baiju on the team, you still want to use his burst because the support sets that you would use on him are generally reliant on having some form of off-field application. But Baiju can straight up be worse than Chi-Chi, because Chi-Chi with Sack Sword just swaps in, presses skill, swaps out. Doesn't extend your rotation. The fact that you can swap out means that if you go Sack Baiju on the rotation where you don't have burst, you can do, if you have him on the Serenade set, you can use his E, you have 8 seconds of Serenade, go to Nefer, do 3 charge attacks, and then back to Baiju and use another E. Or you could do C1 Baiju as well, but I don't know if I'd recommend selecting Baiju C1 just for that. I mean, we've talked talked more about Baiju than we should have. Baiju is not a particularly good option. There's very real opportunity for Nefer teams to get better with future characters, because right now the competition is pretty tame. Yeah, that's also true. Your Hydro options are just so god-awful that even a character like Farina, that doesn't even do anything other than Serenade uptime, Verdant Dew's working, is like pretty solid. Like, it's pretty competitive with your alternatives. I think it's very, very likely that the team will get some stronger Hydro options later on. And finally, we have Sack Frag. I think a lot of people will get baited by the skill reset on Sack Frag. It's not, like, bad to get a skill reset, but unless the whole rest of your team is, like, completely zero field time, getting a skill reset doesn't even necessarily mean you're gonna use it, because you kind of just swap out to refresh your buffs after 6 charge attacks anyways. Yeah, so you do end up only doing 6 charge attacks per rotation, even with Sack Frag, but Sack Frag does allow you to basically bypass the cooldown of the second skill, which means that your rotations, instead of being forced to at least average out around 18 seconds, can now be shortened even more. Verdant Dew generation, if your Hydro is always active, it's 1 per 2.5 seconds. So for 6 charge attacks, you would need 15 seconds of Verdant Dew generation. So your very, very lower limit for rotation length on Nefer, if you're not trying to do the passive Slither state Verdant Dew acceleration stuff, is 15 seconds. And if you're using supports that have field time that is short enough, there are actually a few teams that can get rotations down to about 15 seconds. Mainly, you're looking at the Aino Kuki stuff, where because Aino's animation is pretty short, because Kuki's animation is pretty short, the only off-field animation you actually have to bother with is Lauma, and you get to just have 15-second rotations if you do Sack Frag. That is actually slightly better than 17 to 18-second rotations with Black Marrow or with Witsith, but it's not that much better, and in order to capitalize on the upside for Sack Frag, you need to be doing rotations that are actually shorter. So if you get interrupted and you lose about a second or 2 seconds because of that, you're now doing a rotation that is like 17, 18 seconds, and the Sack Frag effect didn't do anything for you. But it can be a pretty reasonable option otherwise. If I were to rank them from best to worst, I'd say that I'd probably put Sack Frag above Sack Jade now, because it's just too easy to overcap on Sack Jade. But I think the rest pretty good. Artifact stats are incredibly straightforward. You go EM. Yeah, nothing to change about any of this, honestly. I guess I should talk quickly about the support sets on her team. You want Deepwood and you want Serenade no matter what. Generally, you'll have Lauma, you'll have a Hydro, and you'll have a Flex. I like putting Lauma on Deepwood because Deepwood is the most important set, and Lauma's on Deepwood in pretty much all of the teams where you use her. Then, depending on what you play, you either want Serenade on your Hydro or on your Flex. If you're playing something like Nahida, Aino, if you go Serenade on Hydro, Nahida doesn't have a good set she can use anymore. Whereas if you go Serenade on Nahida, you can put Instructor on Aino. You can't put Instructor on Nahida because you'll have too much Dendro, so she's not going to be the one triggering Bloom, whereas Aino will be. Generally, when you're playing 3 Dendro, you put your 2 Dendros on Deepwood and Serenade, and you put your Hydro on Instructor. If you're playing something different, something like Aino Kuki, for example, I generally prefer having Serenade on Aino and Instructor on Kuki, because it's easier to meet your ER requirements on Serenade, because it's a 5-star set that has a 2-piece ER, than it is on Instructor, and Kuki's burst doesn't matter. And if you're playing a character like Nefer as your Flex, because Nefer's damage matters, then you want to go back to Instructor on Aino, or another Hydro. And finally, we have teams. The first slot on the Nefer team is the Lauma slot. If you don't have Lauma, oh boy. Lauma is about anywhere between like 25 and 35% ahead of the next best option for Nefer. It's a very big difference. Yeah, the difference is like actually massive, to the point that in current Stygian Onslaught, Fearless, 4-star weapon, no con, Nefer, without Lauma is like, it needs good optimization to even clear Fearless. With Lauma, you could put a toddler on the keyboard and they'd clear. Although, to be fair, Fearless Hera is probably the hardest boss we've ever had in Stygian Onslaught, so it's definitely exacerbating the issue. If you're someone who just doesn't like Lauma, or if you just didn't get her because you weren't playing when her banner was out, or whatever, right? You can make her teams almost as powerful as C0R0 with Lauma at like C1R0 or C0R1 without. If you don't have Lauma on the slot, you generally still want a Dendro character. Yeah. Well, when I did my testing with Witsith Lauma versus R1 Nahida, I was getting actually pretty consistently slightly better results with Lauma than with Sig, but it wasn't that big of a difference. Then you've got your Hydro slots. There just isn't that much of a difference between the, like, decent options. You can use Aino, you can use Varesa, you can use Xingqiu. Aino is, like, the default option, but unfortunately, Aino sucks ass. So, as much as, like, you can just use her by default, she kind of doesn't do that much for you. And the reality is that C0 Aino just straight up doesn't do anything. Like, she applies Hydro, but that's it. She's not even that good at it. She doesn't give you a buff, she doesn't really deal damage. Also, something I didn't mention here, it's stationary, so if the enemies move a lot, they can just leave Aino's burst, and if they leave Aino's burst, you stop generating Verdant Dew, and you start tickling the enemies, and it feels really, really bad. The Hera specifically, and I guess Sigurd as well, they're enemies that move a lot, so you can really feel it in this Siege and Onslaught. Other than that, you have Xingqiu, and Xingqiu here would be used, just like in Flynn's teams, with alternating skill and burst. The fact that his orbitals are enough is a very big deal, because you don't want to do normal attacks on Nefer. Unlike a character like Maoika, the startup of Nefer's charge attack during skill is not considered a normal attack. Right, with Maoika, like when you start inputting your attack button, it starts with an animation that is the same for the normal and charge attack, and it decides whether it commits to the normal or the charge attack based on how long you hold your button. But because it's coded that way, you can actually see it if you look at it like frame by frame. At the very beginning of the charge attack animation, she goes as if she was gonna hit. But as long as you're holding long enough, she starts drifting instead. That's why the rain swords go off, but they don't do that on Nefer. These three are the main ones, with Aino C6 being the best, then Varesa, then Aino C1 and Xingqiu being pretty much the same, then Aino C0. But honestly, even a character like Kokomi or Sigewinne will be playable. Okay, so Verdant Dew generation is a bit more of a problem than I expected. So Kokomi, Sigewinne, Barbara don't feel that great. They have potential uptime problems. I don't know if I ended up mentioning Nilou here, but Nilou actually works well if you have her C1. Without the C1, the Verdant Dew generation feels awful. It's technically possible to generate 6 Verdant Dew, but if you spend like even 1 second at 3 Verdant Dew at some point during your rotation, because you're pretty much generating exactly 6, you won't be generating enough for your 6th Verdant Dew towards the middle of the rotation. You can use Nilou, but Nilou has a burst animation on her skill, basically. Nilou's skill takes a long time to do. Yeah, so the fact that you have more wiggle room in your rotations does mean that Nilou's pretty solid, actually, if you have her at C1. And then on top of that, Nilou's 100 EM buff only works out when all of your team is Dendro or Hydro. But that might cause a problem. So let's talk about the last lot options. You can use Nahida, but Nahida isn't actually that great. This is another thing that makes the Nilou team a little bit better. The problem with Nahida is burst animation, and that problem isn't actually a big deal anymore. Offensively, the strongest option that I've looked at for now is actually Fischl. Is it because Fischl has great synergy? No. It's straight up just because electro units are pretty solid. They give you 20 more EM from the Dendro resonance because they trigger quick and aggravate spread, whatever. However, she's like at most 5% ahead of what I consider to be the good default last slot, which is gonna be Kuki. Honestly, just use Kuki. Yeah, so again, right, all of this was with the assumption that the rotation length were gonna be gated by animation time and almost only that. But with the better cancels, there's a few characters that are actually as good, if not better. Right, there's Nahida, there's Sucrose with a refresh, and there's Inefa. I think Inefa is actually the best last slot in her teams. One of the upsides of Inefa is that because you now have 3 Nodcry characters, if you go Aino as your last slot, you don't have anyone proccing the Ascendant Gleam effect of increasing lunar reaction damage when non-Nodcry characters use abilities, which makes it so that Aino isn't even really better than the other Hydra options anymore, which allows you to not feel bad about benching her ass, which is nice. Yeah, there's gonna be some stuff maybe with the buffs with Mona, but Mona is also gonna feel awful for application here. Her application is really bad as well. It's not the only option you have though. You can also use Inefa. And Inefa is actually pretty good, especially if the last slot you're using is not Aino. If the last slot you're using is Aino, with Inefa you run into a problem, which is you don't have anyone that isn't from Nodcry, and you're now in a situation where you're not getting the lunar damage bonus from the Ascendant Gleam bonus. So Inefa with Varesa or Inefa with Xingqiu is also offensively some of the strongest things you can do. The thing with Inefa though is she's not actually that synergistic. You don't get pretty much any lunar charge reaction damage. You'll get a few lunar charge hits from her Ascension passive, but it's not even gonna be full uptime because your Hydro application just isn't that great. But even just a few of them can actually be enough to outdamage Fischl because Fischl doesn't have great uptime compared to Inefa. Yeah, there's also the fact that Inefa allows you to get quickened, which gives you a little bit of spread damage on Nefer, on Lauma, on Inefa herself, and actually has a relevant EM buff on her burst. And now that her burst animation is actually something that you have time to do without extending your rotations, it's pretty good. The gap between the strongest offensive option and the worst healer you can use is like 15%, right? If you've been looking for an excuse to play your favorite character Chi-Chi for the past 3 years, here's your excuse. You can just use Chi-Chi. Build her full attack so that she gives you higher lunar bloom bonus from the Ascendant Gleam bonus, and then put her in your last slot. The one thing to keep in mind though is you don't want to use a character that extends your rotation. A character like Diona is gonna suck ass because without the burst she doesn't have. Diona isn't that bad. Alright, you just burst like every other rotation, and it's okay. It's fine. The fact that you can now refresh the Serenade bonus with just skill, right? You just do a tap skill instead of a hold skill so that it's back off cooldown when you swap back to her, and it works. As a general rule, offensively, Inefa, Nahida, and Sucrose are the best 3 for the last slot, and out of those, well, obviously, Inefa has defensive utility, unlike the other 2. Although the other 2 can... I mean, Nahida can go in Proto Amber. It's a bit weirder on Sucrose, because you kind of want sack frag for skill cooldown. But yeah, those are like the best 3. I'd say that for most people, the defensive utility provided by Inefa is going to make her perform better in practice. Same for other defensive utility options, like Kuki. I think Kuki in practice for most people will perform not too far behind Nahida and Sucrose, so it's like, alright. I've been liking Xingqiu as a last slot a lot. Like, clear time differences are barely noticeable, but if you don't have Inefa, Xingqiu makes it feel completely fine to just have the Proto Amber healing from Nahida. You don't really feel like you're in any danger. Like Xingqiu plus Nahida instead of Kuki plus Aino if you have Nahida. If you don't have Lauma, how cooked are you? Honestly, it's not that bad. As much as, you know, Lauma is pretty important for Nefer's damage, Nefer's balance right now is looking pretty good. She's looking pretty strong, and she's gonna be kind of like Flynn's, where, like, yeah, in order for the to get the best Flynn's teams, you need Nefer, but he's also, you know, a character that's getting released in late 2025, going on 2026. So he's not actually, like, noticeably worse without Inefa than, like, Kuni. Like, she'll work. She's also just outright better than Flynn's. So, despite the gap between having and not having Lauma being bigger than with Inefa for Flynn's, the best Nefer team without Lauma is better than the best Flynn's team without Inefa. Yeah, I'd say that, like, right now, if you don't have Lauma, Nefer doesn't really feel too appealing to me. There are characters that deal with the Nefer shill bosses more easily than Nefer herself does if you don't have Lauma. I don't really feel too comfortable recommending anyone get Nefer if they're not also planning on getting Lauma. In her current state, based on what we know so far, based on the combos I've seen be possible, I'd say it's somewhere halfway in between Varesa and Ster. Honestly, I don't really think that's the case anymore. I think that was a bit optimistic, and she got a nerf. And Durin's gonna be a buff to Varesa's options at the very least. Putting all that together, I don't even know if I'd say she's better than Varesa. I'm sorry I doubted you, Varesa. I'll never do it again. She is still, like, one of the better carries, though, for sure. And I do expect her to get better with Columbina. But she's not that good. But the thing is, that's not the reason why I decided not to go for her. The reason I decided not to go for Nefer is because, honestly, she feels bad to play. So let me quickly talk about, and I guess this is gonna be like the equivalent of a first impressions video, because I didn't record one of those. But I want to quickly talk about my issues with Nefer's gameplay. The Verdant Dew stuff, I think, is fine, right? It adds a dynamic element that you have to keep track of, and that's okay. But there's one thing I really don't like about her gameplay and her kit design, and it's there isn't really any sort of, like, visual or audio noticeable feedback that tells you whether you got the charge attack to go through or not. Right? So you kind of have to just like stare only at the Verdant Dew numbers. All right, the Verdant Dew's on the left of your character, on the right of your screen next to your list of characters. And you don't get to actually pay that much attention to what's going on other than that. Right, at least until you get used to it. But I just think it's kind of a shame that it doesn't really feel satisfying to land her combos, because there is no, like, there's no hit lag, there's no, like, it feels like they undercooked the animations, basically. The animation is fine and the visual feedback is there when you don't cancel it, but I feel like they just didn't give a f about what the gameplay looked like when you do cancels, and because cancels are necessary for her not to suck ass, it's a shame. That was the first thing. The second reason why I didn't go for her is because I did not like her in the story at all. It's been a while since there was a character that I disliked more. Yeah, the last one was probably Alhaitham, and before that it was like Raiden or Ayaka. But yeah, Nefer just, I did not like her characterization at all. And I think that conceptually she's a cool character, but they did not do a good job of convincing me that she is very good at her job or smart. They tell us that she is, but then they keep having her do the stupidest shit, and you're just like, Nefer, why are you doing this? And having her do that when she's next to Lauma, she can't handle herself when she's next to a pretty lady, like, I get, like, whatever. But they never actually show us her doing things, like, competently when Lauma isn't there. Whatever. Anyway, this isn't meta relevant at all. I talked a lot about whether or not I would get Nefer in the past few weeks, and it's one of the major factors that contributed to my decision of not going for it, so I wanted to at least mention it. The point is, though, the reason I'm not getting her isn't because she's weak. I don't think she's weak. She's a pretty good character. That pretty much does it. Again, just like Flynn's, her meta relevance is going to be, like, in the long term, is going to be very dependent on how strong they make Columbina. With all the witch buffs, a lot of characters are passing the 100k DPS threshold and are making it so that Nefer isn't, like, that far ahead of the other characters, which is also another contributing factor, I guess, to why someone might not want to go for her. Anyways, that's pretty much it for the post release. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you learned a thing or two, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.